morning, learners. Today we are going to start with another poem in your course called The Shed by Frank Flynn. Now here's the picture of a shed. You can take a look. Before we begin the poem, I'm going to give you a small activity. For that, bring out a pen and a paper and look at this picture carefully. Now you can pause the video right here. Look at this picture closely. Think about what it makes you feel. Think about the features of this shed right here. And think about what all it could contain. You can pause the video and you can do this activity. Then we'll move ahead. Alright, now I hope you've written something. Let's begin the activity. So how will you describe the shed? You just saw a picture. How will you describe it? My advice is use more and more adjectives to describe this shed that you just saw. Pick out at least 3 words to describe it. Okay, now I'm going to tell you the words that I have put together. It is scary, it is spooky, it is isolated, it is spacious, it is empty, or it could be stuffed. Scary means something which makes you very fearful, something which scares you. Spooky is similar to scary, something which is which makes you scared. Isolated, something which is very far away from everything else, something which is aloof, something which is separate from other things. Spacious, this shed looks very huge. It looks like it has a large space inside of it. That's why it could be termed as spacious. Now empty, it could be completely empty, it could be completely abandoned, it could be just left like that. It could not contain anything, or it could be stuffed. Stuffed means when there is a lot of things in a small space, that's when we say that something is stuffed. So there could be a lot of stuff. I hope you've written at least 2 or 3 words to describe this shed. If you haven't, go back to the picture, look at it closely now and describe it in your own words. Now moving on to the next thing, what things are you likely to find in a shed? I'm going to wait here for you. Think about all the things that you could find in a shed. Just imagine that you are entering this shed. Imagine all of the things that you are going to find in this shed. Pause the video and note down at least 5 words that come to your mind when you think about the things that you are likely to find in this shed. Now I'm going to list the things that I was able to come up with. The first is tools. It could be a tool shed. The second thing is grains. There could be grains in it, there could be fruits in it, there could be any sort of harvest produce, any sort of agricultural products that are grown in a field. There could be animals, it could be an animal shed, there could be cows, buffaloes, or any other animal that could be kept in this shed. There could be vehicles, there could be a bike. The picture that you just saw of the shed previously had a bicycle parked right outside it. So there could be vehicles inside this shed. There could be furniture, any old furniture, any old stuff that people don't use anymore, any discarded item, any household thing that you don't use anymore could be kept in this shed. There could be insects. Now this is one thing which you would not want to find, but it might just be present. There could be spider webs, there could be lizards, there could be all sorts of insects, there could be any small animals, rats maybe, or anything. Now keep both of these lists with you. We are going to use them later in the video. Now let me introduce the poem and the poet to you. This poem was written by Frank Flynn. There is a shed in the poet's garden. So the poet talks about a shed which is there in his garden. He's curious to find out what is inside that shed. He's excited. He wants to find out what is there inside that shed. He explores his feelings about that shed and what it possibly contains. So he keeps thinking about the things that could be there in that shed. He's very curious to know what's there. and he explores his feelings about that shed. So when he's thinking about all of the things that could be present there, there are mixed feelings in his heart. Sometimes he's scared, sometimes he's curious, sometimes he wants to find out what's there. So he explores his feelings when he is talking about this shed. Will he be able to go to the shed without being scared? Will he be able to visit the shed and see for himself? Let's find out. Let's jump straight into the poem right now. Let's read it. You can pause it and read it for yourself, or you can read it along with me. There's a shed at the bottom of our garden with a spider's web hanging across the door. The hinges are rusty and creak in the wind. When I'm in bed, I lie and I listen. I'll open that door one day. There's a dusty old window around at the side with 3 cracked panes of glass. I often think there's someone staring at me each time that I pass. I'll peep through that window one day. My brother says there's a ghost in the shed who hides under the rotten floorboards, and if I ever dare to set foot inside, he'll jump out and chop off my head. But I'll take a peek one day. I know that there isn't really a ghost. My brother tells lies to keep the shed for his den. There isn't anyone staring or making strange noises, and the spider has been gone from his web, since I don't know when. I'll go into that shed one day soon, but not just yet. So this is the poem. Let's move on to the analysis of the poem stanza wise. There's a shed at the bottom of our garden with a spider's web hanging across the door. So the poet says that there is a shed at the bottom. At the bottom means at the very far end of our garden, there's a shed with the spider's web hanging across the door. So there is a spider's web that is hanging across the door. Here's a picture for you to look at. Look at how old the door looks. How out the door looks, and there are 2 spider webs on this door. Now what do spider webs signify? They signify that this door is not in use, right? It is abandoned, it is very isolated, so nobody goes there, nobody opens the door daily. Therefore spider webs have taken over this door. The hinges are rusty and creak in the wind. Hinge is a sort of a joint, right, on which a gate or a door depends. So a hinge is a movable joint on which a door, a gate or a lid swings. I'll show you the picture of a hinge. Here's the picture of a hinge, right? So the hinges are rusty. Rusty means there is rust on the hinge. It is getting corroded. It is decaying. The hinges are not very new. They are very old. That's why they are rusty. So the hinges are rusty and they creak in the wind. So creak means to produce a very high pitched, very unpleasant, very bad sound, which just makes you very uncomfortable. So the hinges are rusty and they creak in the wind. These hinges have become so rusty that if you try to open that door, it creaks, and when the wind blows across this shed, the hinges produce a lot of creaking sounds. When I'm in bed, I lie and I listen. So the I is the poet here. He says that when I'm in bed, I just lie there and I listen. Listen to what? Listen to these unpleasant sounds. And he keeps on thinking about the shed, how the door is covered in the webs and all of that, right? I'll open that door one day. So this line, this signifies that the poet wants to go and open that door one day and look what's there, look inside it and find out what's there inside the shed. Moving on to stanza number 2, there's a dusty old window around at the side. So at the side of this, now the poet is trying to describe the shed. So on one side there's a window, and what does that window look like? It's a very dusty, very old window. Now here's a picture for you to look at. This window, look at the picture closely. There are a lot of small spider webs here, cobwebs here. It is very dusty and it's very old. It does not look very new or very fresh, right? So there's a dusty old window around at the side with 3 cracked panes of glass. Look at this picture. There are 3 broken window panes, right? So the windows are old and they have broken window panes. Panes means a thin sheet of glass, right? So it has 3 cracked panes of glass. I often think there's someone staring at me each time that I pass. So the poet says, whenever I pass around this shed, whenever I try to go around this shed, I feel as if somebody is staring at me. Staring means to look very closely. So I feel as if somebody is looking at me in a very spooky manner, right? I'll peep through that window one day. Towards the end, the poet again expresses his desire. He wants to go to this shed one day and he wants to peep through that window. Now, peep means to look through a narrow opening. When you try to hide yourself, but you still try to look at something, that's called peeping. Here's a picture for you to look at. This boy or whoever this is trying to peep through a hole. So that's what our poet wants to do. He wants to go to the shed and he wants to peep through the holes, peep through those windows and see if there is anybody inside that shed who is staring at him, right? Next stanza. My brother says there's a ghost in the shed. So the poet's brother has told him that there is a ghost in that shed who hides under the rotten floorboards. So rotten means decaying or decomposing, something that is going bad. Like if you keep an apple out in the open, if you don't keep it in the refrigerator, it goes rotten, right? Similarly, the floorboards are going rotten. Rotten means they're decaying, they're slowly withering away, they're decomposing. So my brother says there's a ghost in the shed. So there's a ghost in the shed, and where is this ghost hiding? It's hiding under the rotten floorboards. So I'll show you the picture of the floorboards. These are floorboards. These are wooden boards that cover the floor. So he says that the ghost hides under the rotten floorboards, the old floorboards, and if I ever dare to set foot inside, the poet says that if I ever will be able to gather the strength, if I ever dare to set foot means to go inside, if I ever dare to go inside, he'll jump out and chop off my head. Now chop means to cut into pieces, like you chop vegetables. So his brother has told him that there's a ghost and he keeps on hiding inside under those floorboards. And if you ever go inside that shed, he will jump out and chop off his head. Now whose head? The poet's head. Here he says my head. My means the poet's head. But I'll take a peek one day. But the poet is still hopeful. His desire is still there. He still says that I'll take a peek one day. He wants to take a look one day. He wants to peek inside the windows one day and find out what's there. Stanza number 4. I know that there isn't really a ghost. My brother tells lies to keep the shed for his den. So the poet is kind of reaffirming, assuring himself. He's trying to make himself believe that there is no ghost inside. He's trying to convince himself, he's telling himself that he knows that there is no ghost there. It is just his brother who tells him lies to keep the shed for his den, to keep the shed for his private purposes. He knows that his brother is lying to him, and because he wants to keep the shed for his den, because he doesn't want the poet to go inside his den, right? There isn't anyone staring or making strange noises. So the poet also tells us that he knows that there is nobody making strange noises. It is something that he has just kind of imagined in his head. This is not reality. And the spider has been gone from his web since I don't know when. He also tells us that the web is there, however, there is no spider. The spider has long been gone. I'll go into that shed one day soon, but not just yet. So towards the end, the poet says that I will go into the shed one day, very soon I'll go into that shed, but not just yet. So towards the end, he says, not just yet, not right now. It means that the poet is kind of scared to go into the shed. He's constantly trying to convince himself and the reader that there is no ghost, there are no strange people looking at him. He also tries to tell us that the spiders are not there, and there's nothing to be scared about. However, it looks as if he's very, very scared to go inside that shed. He wants to go, but he keeps on postponing his plan. Right? Moving ahead, we have narrative poetry. Look at this picture closely. Now, why are we discussing this? Because this is a narrative poem. So let's discuss the features of the characteristics of narrative poetry. You can pause it here and you can read it. I'm going to discuss all the points here. Narrative poetry tells a story, but it is also a poem. So narrative poem is a poem which contains a sort of a story, right? Narrative poetry includes story elements. All of the elements that we've done in our story writing class, for example, the characters, the setting, the plot, the action, conflict, resolution, dialogue, most of these elements are present in a narrative poetry. There will be some sort of a story, some sort of a plot, some sort of a setting where the action happens. The poet will try to describe where the story is taking place. It uses figurative language and poetic techniques. So it uses language which is very descriptive. So the poet will try to describe a lot of feelings, a lot of words which are descriptive of the things that are visible to him, to the poet, and he will also try to make all of those things visible to the reader, to the audience. So a lot of poetic devices are also used in narrative poetry. So there's rhyme, rhythm, stanzas, metaphor, similes, personification. All of these are examples of poetic techniques which are used by the poets to make the poetry more interesting. It can be written from different points of view. So it can be written from the first person perspective or a third person perspective. So when you use pronouns such as I, you say that it is written from the first person perspective. But when you write it from the third person perspective, just imagine that there are two people and you are the third person. There's something going on between those two people. You are the third person. You're looking at them talking. So if you try to describe a story through a poem and you name your characters and you try to describe what is happening between those characters, that's when we say that you're writing from a third person perspective. So these kind of poems could be written from any perspective. Author's purpose is to entertain. The author's purpose is to tell you a story. Their purpose is to entertain you, to leave the reader with a story to remember. So the final purpose is to give you a story that you will always remember, right? Let's move ahead. You've just read the poem. You can go back and refer to the poem and you can analyze it along with me as I discuss the characteristics of a narrative poem. Let's discuss the characters first. Now name the characters that you found in the poem. If you don't know, you can go back to the poem, you can read it again and find out the names of the characters. I'm going to discuss the answers. The two characters are the poet and his brother. Next up, we have the setting. The setting is the place at which the whole story takes place, right? So where does this story take place? I already told you that it takes place in a garden at the bottom of which there is a shed. So the poet is imagining all of the things that could be present in a shed. And where is the shed present? In the garden, at the very far end of his garden. Next we are going to discuss the plot. Now plot is the storyline, the story around which the whole poem revolves. You can pause and you can think about the main storyline of the poem. I'll tell you my version of it. There is a garden shed in the poet's garden which is abandoned, which is isolated, which is left alone. Nobody goes inside that shed. It has creaky doors and broken windows. The poet wants to know what is there inside this shed, but he's too scared to go there. And why is he scared? Because his brother has told him different stories about ghosts and spiders, and that's why he's too scared to go inside. This is the plot of this narrative poem. Now moving on, we will discuss the conflict. Now what is the conflict? Conflict is a struggle that happens between any two opposite forces in a story, right? So there is a conflict in the poet's mind between what he thinks, what he wants, and what his brother has told him about the shed. So there's a continuous conflict that is going on, right? The poet's brother scared him by telling him that there is a ghost in the shed. The poet is too scared to go to the shed alone. However, he's really curious to know what is there inside the shed. So this is the conflict, the main problem around which the whole story revolves. And why are we saying that it is a story? Because we are saying that it is a narrative poem which contains a story. Now next up we have the point of view. Now I told you already, point of view is the perspective with which the author, the poet is telling you the story, the narrative poem, right? Go back to the poem and find out the pronouns that he uses. Is he using I or is he using he, she, they, right? So if you look at the poem, he's using I. He says, I want to go to the shed. One day I will go to the shed. I will peep into the windows, right? So the point of view is first person point of view. In the end, we have figurative language. Now, what is figurative language? In simplest terms, figurative language is a decorative language. It's a fancy sort of a language which the poets use to enhance the poem, to make the poems look and sound even better. Things like simile, metaphor, personification, all of these are figurative languages. All of these are the examples of figurative language. So poets generally use figurative language in their poetry. However, in this poem, the figurative language does not stand out. But I would like you to go back to the poem and find out all the descriptive words, all the words that describe something. Find out the words that describe what the poet sees. Also try to find out the words that describe what he hears. All of these words are called descriptive words. I'm not going to pause here. You can pause the video and go back to the poem. Right? I'm going to discuss it stanza wise. In stanza number 1, there are 3 such phrases. First is spider's web. So this descriptive phrase just brings an image of a spider's web in your heads, right? The second one is rusty hinges. I already told you that a hinge is a sort of a joint on which a swinging door depends. So it is rusty and it evokes an image of rotten door hinge in your head. So that's why we say that it is a descriptive word. It describes the sort of hinge that the door is hanging by. Creak. This is a word which describes the sound that the old door makes, right? Stanza number 2, dusty old window. I showed you a picture also. It's a descriptive. There are 2 descriptive words, dusty and old, which I used to describe the window on the side of the shed. And the second one is cracked glass panes. So there are glass panes which are broken, which are cracked. Stanza number 3, chop off my head. This brings out a very lively image of somebody chopping off somebody else's head in your mind. So this can be quoted as an example of imagery. Stanza number 4, we have strange noises, weird noises that the poet is scared by. Okay, let's move ahead and let's discuss some other literary aspects of this poem. The first one is tone. Now the tone is the poet's attitude towards the subject matter about which he or she is writing. So the tone here is narrative. I already told you that the poet is trying to tell you a story. So the tone is narrative. He's trying to narrate a story to you. The second word that can be used to describe the tone is inquisitive. Now what do we mean by inquisitive? Inquisitive means to question something. When you're very curious to know something, that's called being inquisitive. When you want to know something very badly, that's called being inquisitive. The poet really wants to know what's there inside the shed. Therefore, we can say that his tone is inquisitive. He constantly keeps on saying that I will peep into it one day, I will go there one day, I'll look into it one day. Now, the second aspect is mood. Tone is the attitude of the poet towards the subject matter, and mood is the feeling that the poet puts you in, that you get while you read the poem as an audience, right? So you have to do one thing. You can go back to those first two lists that you prepared during the first activity. Go back to those lists and read all the words that you've written in the first question. Think about what you feel. Think about all the descriptive words you've written and think about the mood that it puts you in, right? And then come back here. Now I'm going to discuss the two moods that I have been able to come up with, right? So the first word is fearful. The poet makes sure that the reader is fearful because he evokes the images of ghosts, rotten floorboards, old creaky windows. It's a very scary sort of an atmosphere which the poet has created. So the mood is fearful, and the second is curious. Now why curious? Because the poet wants to know what's there inside the shed, and as a reader we also want to know what's there inside the shed. Now the third thing is theme. So there are two themes. First is curiosity and second is wonderment. Now both of these themes are carried throughout the poem. You will be able to find them in every stanza because the poet is continuously curious. He expresses his desire again and again to go inside the shed and to see what's there. He is in awe. Constantly wonders what's going to be there inside the shed. Now that's all. Thank you so much for watching.